Today's scripture passage is Mark 11, verses 27 and 33. You're invited to turn there in your Bible or follow along on the screen behind me. They arrived again in Jerusalem, and while Jesus was walking in the temple courts, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders came to him. "By what authority are you doing these things?" they asked, "and who gave you authority to do this?" Jesus replied, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things. John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? Tell me." They discussed it among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin..." They feared the people, for everyone held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." Jesus said, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." This is God's word.
We are in a really interesting section of Mark's gospel by now. We've remarked the last couple of Sundays that we are now into the section of Mark where he is focusing on the events of just 7 last days of Christ prior to his crucifixion and his resurrection. So everything that happens in these remaining chapters of Mark is a very compressed period of time that is filled with extraordinary events, very important events. And you know it was important to Mark because he chose to designate so much of his time, so much of a proportion of his writing to these 7 days and those events. Now, you got to remember that when Jesus' Passion Week commenced, which was just 2 days before the events we're reading about now, he really stirred up things. He really got things ratcheted up. You'll remember that first of all, he entered Jerusalem to the overtures of a teeming throng of Jewish pilgrims who had collected in Jerusalem for Passover week. And he allowed them to give him what you could only call a Messiah's welcome into town. And you'll remember that Jesus did not try to silence them. He didn't rebuke them for it, much to the chagrin of the Sanhedrin, who thought it was entirely inappropriate for Jesus to let people ascribe to him these messianic psalms. And then the very next day, you'll remember that Jesus went into the temple complex, the temple precincts, and he caused such a scene there that we remember it and we talk about it to this day. I want to show you a couple of photos that just might give you a sense of what went on there when Jesus went into the temple. And of course, these are dramatized events. Nobody was there with a camera, but you see Jesus overturning tables here. Can you imagine Jesus kicking tables over? It's just hard to imagine. It doesn't fit our image of what God can be like. And yet Jesus shows you at times what his wrath can look like when things are going on that are contra to his heart. And so Jesus is turning over tables, and I envision coins rolling all over the stones that comprise the pavement. I imagine the feathers of doves flying through the air as their cages are being disturbed. And I imagine, what would you call the papers that keep the accounting ledgers. I imagine the wind blowing those all over the temple courts as Jesus is turning over these tables. And the next photo shows you Jesus actually with a whip in his hand, driving out the people that are doing this, that are authorized by the chief priests. And you look at that and you think, it's hard for me to imagine Jesus this way. And I always ask myself, how is it that he got away with this? How is it that all of the religious leaders, including the temple police, just let him do this? One single man disturbing this entire event when the temple is filled with people. So I often wonder too, how did the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership, feel about what Jesus did in the temple that day, later that evening? How did they feel about what Jesus had done the next morning? Because I think they probably were kind of spooked on the one hand, and I think on another hand, they were furious about what Jesus had done because Jesus had made them look really bad. Jesus had made them look impotent, out of control, like they couldn't control what was going on in the temple that was supposedly their charge. And Jesus had made them look guilty, as though they were doing something wrong. Now, those are three things that prideful, holy men wouldn't take very kindly to, having their power threatened, having their spiritual aura threatened. And this is what Jesus did. Jesus' cleansing of the temple in Jerusalem that day was a display of God's displeasure with the hearts of Israel's shepherds, the priests. And frankly, for that matter, the whole system that had morphed over the centuries, layering one distortion of God's heart on top of another. So Jesus is acting out a judgment, if you will, on what Judaism has become when he does this in the temple. Now think about it. What had happened to Judaism? Love for God had given way to love of position. You see it in the priests. Love of rank, love of prestige, and love of influence. They cared more about that than they did about God. Love for people had given way to, I'll call it self-interest, self-advancement, and love of the almighty prophet. Because that's what was going on in the temple. Service to God had degenerated into a routine of religious-looking rituals whereby if you just do them, you were thought to be a spiritual person, a good Jew. And it no longer had anything to do with a person's heart or their treatment of other people in their lives. So all of that had become disassociated. So it had devolved. So you see Jesus going into the temple and doing what he does, kicking over tables and driving out people with a whip. You see this very public display on the part of Jesus has made Jerusalem's cultural watchdogs spooked and intensely angry. Now, shortly after having made this scene in the temple, Mark tells us that Jesus again goes to the temple, and we presume that it was probably the very next day. So we're probably looking at Tuesday now, where the events which we read this morning occurred. He entered town on Sunday evening, and then on Monday afternoon or evening, he went into the temple and he did that terrible scene. And then on Tuesday morning, he goes back to the same temple again. And he's walking through and he's teaching people. And we find that the same people who have been humiliated by Jesus the day before come up to Jesus. And I imagine they do so very warily. And yet they're probably seething with anger too. And here's how Mark describes it. In 27 through 28 of chapter 11, he says, they arrived again in Jerusalem. That would be Jesus and his disciples. Remember, he's probably staying the evenings out in Bethany at his friend's house, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They arrive again in Jerusalem, and while Jesus was walking in the temple courts, the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders came to him. By what authority are you doing these things? They asked. And who gave you this authority? Who gave you authority to do this? Now, authority is a significant issue. I was thinking about authority this week and all the different ways that authority is involved in our lives. Think about this. If somebody comes to your door in an official-looking uniform and they are requesting entrance so they can inspect your electrical system or your power consumption or for gas leaks or something, while they got a official-looking uniform on, don't you think you're going to want to see some ID when you didn't call for them? You're going to want to see some ID that proves that they really are who they say they are, and they have the authority to come into your house and check these things. You're not going to just let anybody walk in. Authority matters. Do they really represent who they say they represent? That's about authority, isn't it? Let's say that it is election time. And you know those ads that come on TV all the time during election cycles? You know, don't you think it's important to watch the thing all the way through to the end until you hear the spokesperson say, paid for by so-and-so for Congress or whatever? Because that'll probably tell you a few things, right? Who's paying for it? which will explain why they have the take that they do, generally speaking. Authority matters. Let's say you are at work and you make the decision to authorize a $10,000 expense on a company credit card without having gotten approval from the people who are over you. How's that going to fly? That's not going to go real well because authority matters. Now, what's interesting is that none of these kind of examples that I've just listed really has anything remotely to do with some of the most fundamental issues of life. These are all peripheral issues. Now, what if somebody comes along and he begins challenging the most fundamental issues of life? Issues about why you live, what you believe. Why is this important? Don't you think you might want to see some ID? You might want to card the person? I was trying to be fair to Jewish religious leaders of Jesus' day this week as I thought about all this, because it's so easy to just treat them as the bad guys all the time. It's so easy to just characterize them one-dimensionally, that they're all bad all the time, and there's nothing legitimate or good about them, because they do seem to be the villain in most of the scenes that play out in the Gospels. But I thought, these are real people, and they're complex, just like you and I are complex. And so trying to be fair to them, you and I must understand that when Jesus came along, he challenged so much of what they held dear, and so much of what they believed to be true, or the way to live life as a good Jew. Think about this. 1,500 years of Jewish culture was being challenged by Jesus. Now that's unthinkable. How long has the United States of America been around? How deep is our culture? 1,500 years? What, 250 years? Just generalizing it? Okay, so your values as an American, the way you view the world as an American, the way you think about things simply because you're an American. Somebody comes along and they start challenging notions like that, and you get all upset, you get all defensive. Well, what about 1,500 years of the way things are done as a Jewish people group? The way we understand God, the way we understand what Jewishness is, and the fact that we are different from everybody else on the face of the globe because we are these things. Somebody comes along after 1,500 years and starts suggesting that you have misunderstood things? That's not going to make you want to ask for some credentials? You see what I'm saying? And so Jesus comes along and he challenges things like Sabbath regulations. How do we observe the Sabbath? He even comes along and he says, I am Lord of the Sabbath. Now, if that's not blasphemous, I don't know what would be. He comes along and he challenges things like what is really clean and what is really unclean. And how does that which is clean get made unclean? Jesus says, the way you all been thinking about this for 1,500 years, you're misguided. Somehow you wandered off the path. And here he goes into the temple. And he starts saying this whole Passover machine here, it's all wrong. And he starts driving everybody out of the temple. So imagine how these leaders feel. Jesus is sending a message that something has gone terribly wrong in the way people were understanding God and the way that played out in their lives. Now that is astonishing enough. Now let's add another layer to that. Jesus also comes along and he speaks and behaves in such a way as to communicate the fact that all of Judaism from its very inception really was meant to be like a flashing neon arrow pointing to him. Like it was a long and winding path through the pages of history that's supposed to lead right to his feet where people will bow. Do you not understand how audacious and bold all of that sounds? Can you understand now why some people might want to see some ID? So it was only natural then that anybody who had a brain would feel the need at some level to ask, where does Jesus get off behaving this way? How dare he make the kinds of claims he's making? Just who is this? And where does he get his authority? So frankly, I don't think it's easy for you and me, so far away, so far removed from the culture of Jesus' day, to understand how significant the disruption was. I think it's very hard for us to grasp this. And so they come up to Jesus in the temple the day after he makes this incredible scene. They're probably sheepish, but they're seething with dislike for him. And they say to Jesus, what we all have been suggesting here, where do you get your authority? Who gives you the right to behave this way? Legitimate question. Now, it occurred to me as I thought about this passage all week long, these people wanting ID from Jesus, that questions can come from different motivational centers in our lives, can't they? In other words, two different people may ask the same question, but it will come from a very different place in the heart of the individual who asked the question. In other words, the same question may reflect an honest inquiry of faith that comes out of an honest desire to know, like the blind man who was healed by Jesus, and he didn't know who Jesus was, who had healed him, because Jesus has lost himself in the crowd, and the man could finally see, and Jesus comes up to him, and he starts talking to him, and then the man says, so who are you, Lord? Who are you? That's an honest question, and it's a question that comes from a place of faith. But now these Pharisees basically are asking the same question. Who are you? Who do you think you are? Where do you get your authority? And we see that in them, it's coming from a place of disdain and disbelief. It's not an honest question. It's more an accusation. So the motivational center out of which a question comes makes a big difference. I think the spirit of question, the questions that were put to Jesus that day in the temple, were rather this: what right do you have, Jesus, to be behaving this way? Who do you think you are? So these guys believe that Jesus is behaving in a very presumptuous manner. Now think about this, because Jesus is acting like he has some kind of authority over what's allowed to take place in God's temple. Now that is a bit audacious. Jesus is acting like he's got some sort of authority over how people should worship. That's rather bold. Frankly, and anyone who's going to act like that really ought to have some credentials, which led me to realize, don't you realize that that's what Jesus has been doing for the last 3 years? Establishing his credentials? Do you ever think about the miracles that Jesus did? So many of them recorded for you in the Gospels. Why has Jesus spent 3 years doing miracles? Now, there are different levels on which you can answer this question. There are different reasons that Jesus has done miracles. But I want to point out to you that one of the reasons that Jesus' miracles were done, and the reasons that they're recorded for us, is this issue of credentials. Credentials. These miracles show an absolutely exclusive authority over things like time, where he bypasses the natural time required to turn water into wine. Authority over things like matter, like when he speaks to a storm and a sea, which is very turbulent, and it calms immediately. Now, these are extraordinary credentials. They are extraordinary. They are not run-of-the-mill credentials. But don't they kind of trump every other kind of credentialing? We want to see a diploma. We want to see a driver's license. But when you have that kind of authority, that is an extraordinary kind of credential. But now ask yourself, how has the Sanhedrin responded for 3 years to the kind of credentialing that Jesus has displayed? May I remind you? They'd accused him of being mad. They had accused him of being demon-possessed, doing his miracles by the power of Satan, not the power of God. They'd accused him of being a charlatan. And so when they come to Jesus on this Tuesday in the temple, demanding credentials from him, is it surprising after all of that that Jesus would not be willing to play that game? That's what occurred to me this week. When they posed this authority question to Jesus, what do you suppose they were hoping that he would say? Ask yourself that. Jesus, what authority do you have for doing these things? Where do you get your authority? What are they hoping that he will say? Well, on the one hand, maybe they're hoping he will say, well, I don't really have any authority, which I can't imagine that he would have said. If he had said that, that would have sort of, that would have discredited himself. On the other hand, maybe they were hoping that it would say, I have the authority from God, in which case they will just simply accuse him of blasphemy. So once again, they're doing their same thing. They're trying to get a soundbite from Jesus that will be condemning, so that they have legitimate cause to do what it is that is within their hearts, to kill him, to rid themselves of him. So on the one hand, if he says, I have no credentials, that's to discredit himself. On the other hand, if he claims divine authority, it would have been seen by the Sanhedrin as blasphemy. So Jesus then sees no reason, and this is an interesting quote that I found in a Bible commentary from an African man. The guy says, Jesus saw no reason to discuss who he was with people who were determined not to believe anything he said. Now that's very interesting to think about if you bother to reflect on that. Now, I want to try to make this personal a little bit here before we go any further. I would like to try to put the religious leaders' question to you. They come to Jesus and say, who do you think you are? You act like an authority. Where's your authority coming from? Who do you think you are? Okay, let me put that question to you. Who do you think Jesus thought he was? Now, I would like to hear from you. Who do you think Jesus thought he was? He thought he was God. What else? He didn't think, he knew. But just, if you put yourself in the skin of the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, this is what you would assume. He's acting like he thinks he's God or something, which is why they keep trying to nail him by, on charges of blasphemy and such. Who did Jesus think that he was? Did Jesus indeed have legitimate authority over what's allowed to transpire in God's house? Yes, he did. I will tell you this, he sure thought he did. Look how he behaved. Now, what's interesting is if you bother to think about that, in a very subtle way, you and I are then forced to wrestle with this question. Since Jesus sure thinks he has authority to regulate what goes on in God's house, he's making a statement there. You and I are forced then to ask the question, so is he a nut job? Or is he legit? Because he sure thought he had authority to regulate what was going on in the temple. Now, let's look back at Jesus' response when the religious leaders come to him and want to see ID. Verse 29. Jesus replied, I'll ask you one question. Answer me, and I'll tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. And I kind of thought to myself, Jesus is playing some kind of game with them. One of the things I like to do is I like to have an opportunity during the week that leads up to speaking on a certain passage in the Bible. I like to have a chance to talk to a couple of people about it and pick their brains as to what they're seeing going on there. So I had a chance to talk to my wife a little bit about this particular passage early on in the week. And we look at what Jesus is doing. The Pharisees come and they say, tell us by what authority you're doing these things. He says, let me ask you a question. You answer my question, then I'll answer yours. And she said it reminded her of the phrase, don't kid a kidder. Okay, do you guys know what that phrase is? I've heard it, but I never really thought about it. Don't kid a kid, or you can't kid a kidder. It's kind of assuming that a person who makes does a lot of kidding around or playing practical jokes, that they're probably the best ones to tell when somebody's playing a practical joke on them. It implies a certain amount of insight, because if you practice this regularly, you're probably good at detecting it in somebody else. Which then led me to think about, you see, it's an old movie, it's an old Leonardo DiCaprio movie. Catch Me If You Can, is that what it was called? Is that right? Catch Me If You Can. Do you guys know what the movie was about? Frank Abagnale Jr., okay, who was this just incredible, what's the word, counterfeiter? I mean, he could assume any role. He could pass himself off as a doctor, as an airline pilot. He was just so good at playing roles, and he was an incredible counterfeiter, and that's really what got him into so much trouble. In fact, he was assuming different roles, and he was counterfeiting checks and ripping off people all over the country by check fraud. And so the FBI finally catches up with him, because he's so hard to catch, but they finally catch up with him. And what do they do with him? They put him in charge of the financial, as a financial fraud consultant. Basically because you can't kid a kidder. Because the thinking is that people who are good at breaking the law are also good at detecting when other people are doing it. That's kind of the thinking behind it. So it's possible that Jesus is kind of saying to the religious leaders of his day, look, I know who you are. I know what's in your hearts, and I know you're not really looking for an answer to this question. I know you're only wanting a soundbite that will be used to condemn me. So let's play a game. I'll ask you a question, and if you can answer it, then I'll answer your question. And he knows they won't answer the question he's going to pose. I think that is going on here. But I also think there's more to it. It could be as simple as this. Did you know that that's the way rabbis taught? When people would come with a question, they would respond with a question. They don't just give answers. You're going to come to me with a question. I'm going to ask you a question, and that way you're going to really have to think. I'm just going to give you information. Now, some people hate when people teach that way. But I will tell you, it makes you exercise your brain. And you probably come away with a whole lot more if you have to come to a conclusion yourself rather than somebody just dispensing information to you. So rabbis, that's the way they taught. So Jesus was just doing what rabbis do. You're going to ask me a question. I'm going to ask you a question. So let's do this. Now, there was something special about Jesus in his role as one who responds with a question, though, that kind of blows me away when I think about it. No rabbi ever silenced the evil intention challenges of an opponent the way Jesus did. No. Oh, my goodness. When he did this, it shut people down. And no rabbi's response ever probed and exposed the heart of the questioner the way Jesus' responses did. Remember the rich young ruler. Different motivations in the people who came to Jesus with questions, but nonetheless, Jesus responds with questions, and his responses drive people deep into the heart. Nobody has ever done this the way Jesus does. Now look at verse 30. Listen to Jesus' response. The Pharisees come, or the Sanhedrin members come, and they say to Jesus, "Where do you get your authority to do these things?" And Jesus says, all right, I'm going to pose to you a question, and if you're willing to answer my question, then I'll be happy to answer yours. And here's the question. John's baptism, was it from heaven or of human origin? Tell me. Very simple question. Very simple question. Now, before we sort of probe the depths of this, I want to make you think. When Jesus puts that question to the religious leaders, does he have a correct answer in his mind? In other words, what does Jesus think was the origin of John the Baptist's ministry? Does he think that John the Baptist really had divine authority behind him? Or does Jesus think that John the Baptist was just some guy giving his best human thoughts on stuff? We don't have to wonder that because Jesus tells us. Jesus spoke on that very question as recorded in Matthew, and I share it with you. Listen to what Jesus believed about John the Baptist's ministry. Matthew 11:7. As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John, i.e., John the Baptist. What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If anything described John the Baptist, it wasn't a reed being blown around by the wind. He was stiff and stern, and he knew he stayed the course. Jesus said, if not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No. Those who wear fine clothes are in king's palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. No, pause. So where does Jesus believe John the Baptist got his authority? From God. He's a prophet and more than a prophet. Now he explains that, verse 10. This is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare the way for you. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. So again, the question is, what does Jesus think was the authority for John the Baptist's behavior? Heaven, God. So he knows this when he presents the question to the Pharisees or to the religious leaders. All right? Now, this question is going to push them into a really tight corner, isn't it? They are forced to huddle up. It's time to phone a friend. And so that's what they do. Listen to how Mark describes it in verses 31 to 33. They discussed it among themselves and said, if we say from heaven, then he'll ask, then why didn't you believe him? Good point. No, you don't notice the Pharisees actually being concerned about why they didn't believe John the Baptist. But they didn't believe him. But they certainly didn't want to admit it. Next, he continues. If we say of human origin, ... Mark doesn't even finish the question or the statement. He just says, they feared the people, for everyone held that John really was a prophet. And so they answered Jesus, we don't know. We don't know. Now, this is another very subtle thing that Jesus does here. Because in a subtle way, again, he's claiming divine authority. For he knew where John the Baptist's authority came from. And what's interesting is that he also knew what John the Baptist, under divine authority, had said about him, Jesus. Let me remind you of that. This is recorded in John 1. John 1 says, John testified, and I would add, under divine authority, as we've already established. John testified concerning him, Jesus. He cried out, saying, this is the one I spoke about when I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me, even though chronologically Jesus was younger in age. Out of his fullness we have received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now listen to this. This is what John the Baptist, under divine authority, said about Jesus. He said, no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made God known. John the Baptist, under divine authority, says this about Jesus. So when Jesus poses the question, he's actually making a claim to divine authority here, even though the Sanhedrin probably doesn't quite catch that. Now, let's go back to the disingenuous question being posed to Jesus in the temple. These guys, rather than answering Jesus' question, they put their fingers up in the air and they test the wind. If we say this, then this. If we say that, then... Notice how they're not concerned at all with what's true. They're only concerned about what's going to get them in the biggest hot water. They don't want to be viewed as being on the wrong side of an issue. They're not concerned with what's true. Only what's to be gained by answering the question in this way or that way. Guys, that's slimy. Guys, that's terrible. And I think it's a place for personal application. There is a danger in our lives, guys, of being way more concerned with people's opinions of us than we are with what is true and that we are with what is right. But there's such a temptation. And when that kind of a scenario describes you or me, we are showing ourselves to be more in love with the praise that comes from people than we are with the praise that comes from God. And that is not good. And I wanted to look at a verse just to make this case. 1 John chapter 2. Don't love the world or anything in the world. By the way, that includes the praise of human beings. Because if anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. And the world and its desires pass away. But whoever does the will of God lives forever. So don't live or make your decisions based upon your need for the praise of people. Base it upon your love for God and what He says is true. Now, their question about Jesus' authority was a legitimate question. I don't believe that it was. They wanted, as I said, a soundbite from Jesus, a self-condemning soundbite that would make him sound blasphemous. And so Jesus refuses to answer the question. Now, what do you think about that? And this is the last thought I want you to think about here. Jesus flat out refuses to tell them what is true about himself. It brings an ethical question up to me. Are you always obligated to give a response to somebody, anybody who asks you a question, regardless of the motivation for their asking you a question? Just because somebody asks you a question, are you obligated to give them a true response? And I'm not suggesting you give a false response, but do you owe them a response? Because I just watched Jesus here, and Jesus just refuses not to tell them what is true. Why? Because he knew what they would do with it, and so he wouldn't answer it. That's fascinating to me. Do you know that there are some people, and I have run up against these folks, at different points throughout my life. Some people seem to think that all occasions are equal for the stating of everything that's true. Does that make sense to you? Track with that. Some people seem to think that all occasions are equal for the stating of everything that is true. So just because it's now, you should say everything that is true now. Everything you can think of that is true. And I find that kind of to be flawed reason. Do you realize that Jesus actually said, I have more things to tell you, but you are not able to bear them? And so he didn't tell them. So that he recognized that not all times are equal for the sharing of what is true. You and I also need to be people who understand that there is this thing called wisdom. There is this thing called love. There is this thing called timing. There is this thing called tact. All of that requires wisdom. And Jesus is exercising wisdom here when he refuses to state what is clearly true to people who are asking him where he gets his authority. Should Jesus have said, my authority is from God, because I am God? Why does it's true, right? Why doesn't he tell them that? Because he knows better than that. So he refuses to answer the question. Now, I think there's something for you and I to be learned, for something for you and me to learn there. And it's about wisdom. Because not all opportunities are equal for the stating of what is true. I hope that's not too heady. I hope that makes sense to you. Now, here's a final reflection for you. I am convinced that Jesus' response would have been different if these folks had come to Jesus with that question coming from a different place in their hearts. He would have not have denied the opportunity to speak the truth to them if they were coming from a different place in their hearts. And I thought, well, how about you and me? If we are honest with the questions that we have about God, the things that we don't understand about God, the hang-ups that we have about God. Those things come from different places. I think it's good if you and I actually talk to God and ask him to open our eyes to whether our questions and our issues with God come from a place of trust, or do they come from a place of unbelief in our own hearts? We should ask God to help us see that accurately. And it occurred to me that when you bother to ask God to open your eyes to such a thing, that is actually an act of faith. Because you're accepting that He is, and that He hears, and that He has an interest in answering. That in itself is an act of faith, and I think that should be encouraging to some of you who struggle with it. I'm going to end in prayer. Father, I thank you for giving us such an intriguing passage. Lord, I personally feel like this passage creates way more questions in me than it does providing answers. But there are some things in this passage that clearly are to be learned. Jesus is an extraordinarily wise person. And we shouldn't be surprised by that, but the level of wisdom actually is sometimes astonishing to us. Lord, I pray that we would have hearts that are receptive to Him, so that our questions for Him come out of a place of trust, like, who are you, Lord? And not, who do you think you are? Two entirely different postures. Help us to depend upon Him and to believe Him even when we don't understand, and to trust Him and to follow. This is our prayer. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.